Okay. First of all, this isn't written by God, so in any case, we're not perceiving the thoughts and feelings of God by reading these words. They're written by people. They're written by various different people in different periods of time, each of them with their own set of interests. But, you know, the British people have Shakespeare, and Jewish people have the Torah. This is our literature, you know, this is our literary heritage, and I believe we should treat it as such, not as an instruction manual, and definitely not as a history book, which it's very far from. So we're not looking at these incidences as actual literal stories, but we read them for what they are, which is what is the kernel of the narrative in the Torah, in the Bible. And I'm sure, you know, people growing up here, you mentioned Dutch church tradition, so I'm sure some of you know these stories, but very, very briefly for those from a completely secular background. The kernel story, the nugget in there, is that the Hebrew people were, according to these legends, were slaves in the land of Egypt for the Egyptian Pharaoh. And they labored for him. And then one day, the leader of the Hebrew people, Moses, and his brother Aaron, they came to the Pharaoh and they demanded, "Let my people go, allow us to be free." And Pharaoh refused, but then Yahweh, or Jehovah, said, "Okay, well, if you refuse, then I'm going to punish you and I'm going to send plagues upon you." And so he sent the plague of blood and the plague of frogs and all the other plagues. And finally, eventually, Pharaoh broke down and said, okay, fine. All right, I'll allow you to go, get out of here, leave. And so the Hebrew people, the Israelites, left Egypt and they crossed the Red Sea. And then they wandered through the desert. And in the desert, Yahweh provided them with food, provided them with water, and then brought them to a mountain in the desert, Mount Sinai. And as they assembled there, Moses went up top, and supposedly, according to the narrative, he communed with Yahweh, with God, and God gave him the laws, his laws, in the form of these 2 tablets. And then upon receiving these laws of God, supposedly, Moses then walked down the mountain and saw this sight. He was outraged to see, according to the text, that the Hebrew people were worshiping a golden calf. So far, we're on the same page. People have heard this story before. Okay. Now, that's the legend. Now let's get back to the actual facts. Okay, there's no evidence of Hebrew people ever worshiping a golden calf, but there is lots of evidence of Hebrew people worshiping all kinds of gods and goddesses in the Near East. There's actual physical evidence of this. You'd only have to dig down a little bit in Jerusalem to find clay figurines that people had in their own homes. Not just these kinds of fetish objects, but also there are remains of temples to all kinds of gods and goddesses in the Jerusalem area. Because at that time, the Hebrew people were not monotheists, they were monolatrists, meaning that, like other peoples in the Levant, they had their own national god. So he's our God, but there was no conflict between having your own national god and also worshiping other gods and acknowledging and occasionally worshiping other gods and goddesses. And there was also no conflict in other peoples who had their own national gods sometimes coming to worship at your temple and worship your national god. That was not seen as any kind of contradiction back in the day for the vast majority of Israelites. Now, then came along the eliminationist camp of the Jewish people, because if monolatrism is the integration credo of the Jewish religion, monotheism is the elimination credo. And so the monotheists came and they demanded an end to the integration, and they purged Jewish practice of the integration camp. And what did that look like? It looked like stamping out the worship, driving out the worship of any other gods and goddesses. But it also looked like demanding racial purity. And since there was no objection before to interracial relationships or interethnic relationships between Hebrews and non-Hebrews, at that point, the eliminationists demanded and forced mixed couples to divorce. They would not stand for interracial relationships anymore. And those monotheists, rather, those eliminationist Jews were the ones that edited the Torah and who wrote the Talmud and decided what would be the Judaism that we would be left with, the fragments that we would be handed down in this day and age, with the integrationists ejected from the camp. So what are we left with? We're left with temple worship, which is what they encoded. We're left with bloody rituals, whether it's our own infant babies, whether it's animal slaughter, as I discussed earlier, or whether it's slaughtering other people in the Bible. I mean, these stories aren't, again, not meant to be believed as actual fact, but those stories are there, and they're talk about little mini genocides left and right, whether it's enemies of the Jewish people or sometimes even groups of Jews. 3,000 Jews supposedly rebellious against the leadership whose God sanctions them murdering their men, women, and children. Other Jews in the Bible. Read your Bible. It's crazy. So this is the religion we're left with, one that is zealous and jealous and does not allow anything other than eliminationism.